Beginning in October 1945, dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane became available for public sale in the United States. More commonly known as DDT, this compound was a well-known insecticide that proved instrumental in limiting the spread of malaria and typhus among troops during World War II. Due to the success of DDT as an insecticide, it was naturally promoted by the US government for agricultural and household use. Deemed harmless to humans, DDT quickly cemented itself as an integral part of American life, and its properties were deemed no less than miraculous. Over the following years, DDT was everywhere.
Now, what is going to happen to them in adult life as a result of that exposure? We simply don't know.
In her 1962 book titled Silent Spring, American marine biologist Rachel Carson addressed the concerns surrounding our use of pesticides. Focusing primarily on DDT, she and her associated colleagues compiled various instances in which this pesticide had negative effects on bird species, fish, and the human body. The high potential for bioaccumulation, as well as the devastating effects on ecosystems, mark DDT as subject of scrutiny. The release of Silent Spring garnered much public attention, and it was one of the first major catalysts for large-scale calls to action by the public for regulation as it pertained to the environment. It wouldn't be until 7 years later that the American public were once again faced with the harsh reality that something needed to be done with how we manage our industry. In the summer of June 1969, the Cuyahoga River was in a state of disaster. Being heavily polluted by neighboring industry, the stretch of the river that ran through Cleveland, Ohio, posed a major health hazard to residents. Not only was the river a health hazard, but the oil slick that coated the river's surface would result in a story that would become an international headline. On June 22nd of the same year, the Cuyahoga River would ignite into an enormous sea of fire. And while this wasn't the first time the river had caught fire, it would be one of the most important. A month later, a picture would appear in Time magazine showing the river ablaze. While this photo was actually from an earlier incident of a different river fire on the Cuyahoga, the photo drew enough attention from the public that further fanned the fires of the environmental health debate. Then Mayor Carl Stokes, the first black mayor of Cleveland, Ohio, and any major American city for that matter, further urged the federal government to take greater action against pollution control. At this point, the writing was on the wall for most Americans, as well as those in the federal government. It is important to note that Carson's Silent Spring, as well as the Cuyahoga River fire, were not the only events occurring as catalysts at the time for this call to action. But they were a few of many ongoing issues around the country that played a major role in stirring public opinion towards further support of federal involvement in safeguarding the environment. As such, on July 9, 1970, then-President Richard Nixon proposed reorganizing the federal government's executive responsibilities concerning the environment into a single agency. This agency would come to fruition on December 2nd of that same year and would officially establish the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. In the early days of the EPA, staff recall the enormous amount of sense of purpose and excitement in early members. Congress made quick moves to give the EPA agency to have regulatory authority. Expansion to the pre-existing Clean Air Act was also approved in December of 1970. In 1972, Congress would enact the Clean Water Act, the first modern act that would become federal law governing water pollution in the United States. Subsequent acts through the mid to late 70s would further expand the influence of the EPA. Acts such as RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, passed in 1976. It tasked the EPA with setting national goals for waste disposal, conserving energy, reducing waste, and ensuring that this was done in an environmentally friendly manner. It wouldn't be till 1980 that Congress would pass the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, more commonly known as CERCLA, or Superfund. CERCLA would allow the EPA to investigate parties who may have had involvement with polluted sites, as well as use Superfund money to initiate cleanups and recover those costs through legal means. Now at this point, the EPA was cementing itself as a legitimate government agency with the ability to regulate the manner in which we conduct business, disposable waste, and as well fine liability. In 1982, there would be a major shakeup of the EPA due to the new Reagan appointee, Anne Gorsuch. Mishandling of funds, as well as numerous appointees of agency employees from industries targeted for regulation, drew a lot of controversy. Eventually, there would be mass resignations from many leaders from this EPA administration, and Gorsuch would be cited for contempt of Congress due to her refusal to submit subpoenaed documents. This would mark one of the major controversies faced by the EPA, and was one of the first instances of special interest involvement in the Environmental Protection Agency's administration. In 1986, Congress passed the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, which allowed the EPA to gather information on toxic chemicals and share said information with the public. The EPA would go on to collaborate with other international organizations to investigate newly discovered information about ozone depletion in the upper atmosphere. Their investigation would help lead to the signing of the Montreal Protocol in 1987, an international agreement between several countries in an attempt to limit CFCs, HCFCs, and HFCs, highly reactive chemicals that interact with ozone and lead to said depletion. Going into the 90s, the EPA would initiate new major projects, such as the Brownfields program, which would attempt to categorize sites that were underused or abandoned due to contaminations, and still have a potential for redevelopment. In 1994, President Bill Clinton would sign an executive order requiring the federal government to address environmental justice, necessitating that federal agencies consider how their practices may affect minority and low-income communities, groups that were especially susceptible to face higher levels of pollution and environmental hazards. In 1996, Congress would pass another act regulating the use of pesticides and provide special protections for babies and infants. This would go on to further incentivize companies to develop safer pesticides and ensure that registrations of pesticides would be up to date. The EPA was functioning in a manner that upheld the original principles for which it was founded, to protect the environment and enable the federal government to work to serve the American people with respect to their health and quality of life. This was true between administrations, whether Democrat or Republican, with only a single major controversy. The 30-year history of the EPA was that of constant improvement, with Congress building upon already existing laws to further the effectiveness of the Environmental Protection Agency. This would soon change, as the EPA would face more pressure from special interests and face a lawsuit brought by a coalition of 9 states. In the early 2000s, California, New York, New Jersey, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Maine, Connecticut, New Mexico, and Vermont would sue the EPA for violations to the Clean Air Act. It was determined that the EPA had suppressed a study commissioned by Harvard, which found that the position the EPA had taken on mercury emissions did not follow the Clean Air Act. The EPA had at this point been exempting coal-fired plants from requiring the maximum available control technology at the time, an exemption that was determined to be illegal. By 2008, 14 states had joined in the lawsuit, and the Court of Appeals for District of Columbia determined that the EPA was in fact in violation. Around the same time, in 2007, California would sue the EPA for its refusal to allow California, as well as 16 other states, to have the ability to raise its standards for the fuel economy of new vehicles. At this point, it was widely known that the EPA was being influenced by political appointees with their own special interests. In the same year, reports came out that the internal research in EPA was being suppressed by career managers. Administrator Stephen L. Johnson would approve a draft of a document that contained in it references to climate change and how it was a threat to public welfare. Upon arrival of this document to the White House, it would be ignored. This was in an effort to keep it from the public, seeing as opening the document would introduce it to the public record. Johnson would rewrite the document, leaving out references to climate change. In the following years, the EPA would experience changes in policy, heavily dependent on which party was in power. This would continue throughout the 2010s. Quickly, the topic of protecting the environment and regulating our industry no longer was an argument of right or wrong, but a political issue with big money involved.
Here we go, money talk.
Here comes the money, money, money.
Dollar, 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 dollar.
In February of 2017, President Donald Trump would appoint Oklahoma Republican Scott Pruitt as the 14th administrator of the EPA. Scott Pruitt, a denier of climate change, would challenge the quote activist agenda of the EPA. Pruitt was a staunch opponent of environmental regulations, naturally making him the perfect choice to lead the organization tasked with protecting the environment through regulation. As such, some of the new changes that would come in his time with the EPA would be repealing of the Clean Water Rule, postponing of regulations for trichloroethylene and other toxic chemicals, repealing of regulations on methane, as well as halting studies on chemical pollutants classified as PFAS for release. He would eventually be pressured to resign due to conflicts of interest, spending habits, and he would also find himself under 14 separate federal investigations. Surely, this had nothing to do with the $250,000 he received from the fossil fuel industry. Due to the great success of Pruitt under his leadership of the EPA, fellow climate change denier and pro-coal lobbyist Andrew R. Wheeler was next to impress the American people with his love for the environment. Wheeler would go on to dismiss reports regarding climate change and tighten policies that allowed the EPA to obtain certain types of data for their studies. At the time of the 2020 pandemic, Wheeler declared that the EPA would no longer fine companies for violation of environmental regulations for testing and pollution monitoring, as long as the EPA agreed that their reasoning for being unable to comply was due to COVID. That same year, the EPA would decline to raise environmental standards for fine soot pollution, which was linked to 45,000 deaths per year. It was estimated by a draft scientific assessment that this could save up to 12,150 lives annually. These findings were disregarded, and there was no tightening of the rule. During his time at the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA would weaken the rule regarding mercury regulation. There were no rules enacted at this time that reduced air pollution or carbon emissions during his time as administrator. After the election of the Biden administration, the EPA would see huge turnaround in regulations marking a change that would be considered the polar opposite of the Trump admin's approach. New greenhouse gas emission standards were introduced, a PFAS regulation roadmap was created, electric vehicle subsidies were promoted, drinking water standards were tightened, and the EPA created new standards for power plant carbon emissions that would cut CO2 emissions by 65,000 tons by 2028. Many of these changes would not last, and the radical regulatory moves brought forward by the Biden administration would be all but obliterated by what was to come when the ball ended up in the other court.
Today, I'm pleased to make the largest deregulatory announcement in U.S. history.
With the re-election of the Trump administration, Lee Zeldin would become administrator of the EPA in 2025. The EPA would anticipate a 65% reduction in budget, and the process of deregulation would continue. Programs that supported environmental work in low-income communities were also cut. The EPA's Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights was also shut down. With no federal support, many state and local programs could no longer continue their work, seeing as there was no funds to do so. In January of 2026, the EPA would no longer consider the monetary value of lives saved with respect to pollution limits, shifting towards only considering limits based on projected costs to businesses. Finally, on February 12, 2026, the EPA would repeal an endangerment finding relating to the Clean Air Act. The EPA would no longer consider greenhouse gases a public health threat, therefore stripping the government's basis to pursue legal authority with respect to climate change. Zeldin proudly touted what was once a largely technical question on how we can best protect the environment had now become a game of money, power, and special interests. In a 2021 paper, 98.7% of climate scientists said that human activity was causing climate change. This issue tends to be portrayed as a 50-50 scenario, with half of scientists skeptical and the other half on board with climate change, but evidently this is not the case. It is glaringly clear that the goal of the current EPA is to deregulate and remove the protections that keep our environment clean. We've seen this before. We've seen what a deregulated industrial sector looks like. We have real-world examples of this happening right now in the developing world. You cannot simply expect companies to act out of goodwill for the environment unless they are directed to do so by law. Or can you? Despite the massive deregulation and revival of fossil fuels in the United States, our clean energy sector still continues to grow. Currently, clean energy growth is outpacing that of fossil fuels, despite fossil fuels still dominating the majority of our energy. Clean energy procurement hit an all-time high in 2025, with companies buying an additional 27.3 gigawatts of power derived from clean energy. There's still a genuine shift in the market, a shift that is increasingly in favor of green energy. While this is not all-encompassing, there have been improvements in other facets of the economy as well. While many companies still do not have fully implemented measures yet, companies are generally measuring more, disclosing more, and are tightening up supply chains to attempt to reduce waste and pollution. A 2024 study found that 46% of consumers try to buy more sustainable products and try to reduce their environmental impact. It is important to note that consumers heavily influence companies in their practices, and American buying power is very important to many corporations. Companies that are visually pro-environment and pro-sustainability are typically rewarded with consistent consumers and people who are willing to pay a few more extra dollars for something more sustainable. Well, what does this all mean? At the end of the day, this is a very new situation that is still in its early stages. With developments coming out every day, we can do more than just hope for a brighter future. The first step in creating the change we want to see in the world is creating it ourselves. What does the carbon footprint of my diet look like? What are the practices of this company of which I'm an avid consumer? What can I do to help my community that is underfunded or undersupported? These are important questions to ask ourselves. We are just as responsible for this planet as those we elect to represent us. There will always be those who use their power to push forward their own personal interests, even if it is to harm others. This is a fact of life. It is important for us to recognize these facts and hold those in positions of power accountable. The best single thing you can do is be informed. The conditions that led to the creation of the EPA didn't spontaneously appear out of nowhere, and they had years of consequences. A response was forced by the public, and there is no question as to whether or not we can do the same now.